Stephen Roper. I'm a faculty member in the Department of University, and I'm pleased to present some of my research on EU assistance for managing the Ukrainian refugees in the case. This research has been made possible by a Miami, Florida, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Faculty Research Award, and I want to thank the center for their support. Center. So like many of us, I have been watching the unfolding tragedy that has been going on in Ukraine. And there's many different ways in which we can look at the war in Ukraine. Comparative politics, EU politics, and the like. And this research really kind of takes a broad perspective of looking at the Ukrainian war, refugee crisis that has been occurring by focusing on some of these international themes, as well as some of these themes that relate to intergovernmental organizations, such as, of course, the European Union, but also assistance by the UNHCR or the IOM. And so this research has been motivated by essentially trying to understand how the EU's bureaucracy on border management has evolved in this particularly acute time of crisis that Ukraine has been undergoing, border states to Ukraine, and of course, member states to the European Union. So I'm going to present a few slides that kind of set the context of this particular research project. I chose Moldova as the case study because Moldova happens to be one of my countries of interest. I've been traveling to Moldova for almost 30 years now. And I think that it's a very interesting country to use within the context of examining the European Union's commitment to the Ukrainian refugees. It's, again, a particularly useful country because it is both shares a large border with Ukraine. There are within Moldova of ethnic Ukrainians, and it's considered to be part of Europe, but of course not part of the European Union. And so it's a very interesting case study of how a country that is European, but not in the EU, with some of the resource advantages, of course, of being a member of the EU, how does it deal with the influx of refugees? Now, since the start of the war, there's been about 500,000 refugees that have entered Moldova. Those refugees, of course, have continued on to various other locations. So it's served more of a transit point for many of them, gone to Romania, some to the Czech Republic. But almost 90,000, almost about 20% of those refugees have actually stayed in the country. And you see the ebb and flow of the Ukrainian refugees that have been coming. It's interesting, again, to note that in March and particularly April, you had a significant number of individuals crossing the border. And so both Moldovan authorities, EU agencies had a quick learning curve on how to deal with this massive influx of individuals coming in, how to establish proper protocols for allowing people to come into the country who oftentimes had no paperwork because they were fleeing a conflict zone, and how to ensure that those individuals who were most needy were being taken care of in either Moldova or Moldova as a transit country to other locales. The situation in Moldova is extremely complicated because much of Moldova's border with Ukraine is bordering the Bricko region known as Transnistria. In 1992, there was a civil war in Moldova in which this area that you see here, that's known as Transnistria, essentially declared its independence from Moldova. And since 1992 has really functioned as essentially a de facto state. It has its own government offices. It has its own postal system, its own money. There's no question that it exists with support and political support of Russia, but it is making the situation more difficult because obviously you're looking at much of the border with Ukraine, and indeed some of the border checkpoints being contained within this breakaway region. In this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the refugees that have been processed through Moldova proper, and about the EU agencies that have been engaged in that effort. But it is also important to note that within Transnistria, there are estimates that at least 10 to 15,000 Ukrainians have entered into Transnistria and actually have settled there. Again, these are individuals who are not under the auspices of Moldovan authorities. They're not under the auspices of the EU agencies as well. So that's a whole separate issue that ultimately both Moldova, the EU, and Transnistrian authorities will have to examine as they look to resolution of both the conflict, the greater conflict in Ukraine, but more importantly, what happens with these refugees. Complicating, of course, this entire situation is that in July of 2022, Transnistrian authorities declared that they wanted to formally join with Russia. And this is not the first time that Transnistrian authorities have announced this. When Russia invaded Crimea, Transnistria also at that time declared its interest in joining with Russia. But this makes the situation for border management, for processing refugees, a much more difficult process than it is for other countries. And here you have a depiction of the different border crossings in the country. And if we look at this border crossing right here, this border crossing is approximately located right here. It is, up until recently, was the primary border crossing for Ukrainians coming into Transnistria, coming into Moldova. Since 2018, with the intention of relocating border management outside of Transnistrian authorities, the major point of entry now for Ukrainians, although many still are coming in through Transnistria, is these border crossings in the south, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. So the EU border agencies working in Moldova have been there for almost 20 years, and these EU border agencies have been tasked with primarily processing of individuals coming through, particularly through Transnistria. And in 2005, the European Union Border Assistance Mission to Moldova was created. And then later, an assistance mission to Ukraine was also created. The advisory mission for civil security reform in Ukraine. They worked kind of in tandem with law enforcement agencies, rule of law institutions, other customs and border police. So you had this large kind of patchwork of two EU institutions. One was based in Kiev, one was based in Chisinau, working with Moldovan authorities to provide kind of technical support and assistance as the border was considered to be porous, particularly because of the problems occurring with the lack of rule of law and the lack of ability to perform basic customs and border management in Transnistria. On top of that, just a few months ago, Moldova and the EU signed another law that allowed the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, Frontex, to send officers to Moldova to also provide border assistance. So there's no lack of EU institutions that have been providing technical support and other necessary coordinating support to border management in Moldova historically. But right now, there's 3 different EU agencies that are currently working. And of course, Frontex was authorized to begin work in Moldova in March as the situation and the refugee crisis was ongoing in the country, to provide, again, another layer of support and another means for establishing coordination among all these various EU entities. So this kind of research project examined whether or not the developing EU border infrastructure in Moldova, in which you have oftentimes overlapping jurisdictions, operational issues that occur, integration challenges that occur, because you have really 3 separate bureaucracies, albeit they're all EU agencies. But they have their own protocols, their own kind of operational programs in place. How does the EU coordinate its own agencies when you have these kind of overlapping needs and overlapping jurisdictions? And this is, I think, an issue that can be looked at in many different aspects of the EU, as EU institutions have grown exponentially, as the mandates and needs of the EU have grown exponentially, and as the membership of the European Union has grown as well. So I think looking at the bureaucracy of the EU, in this case, looking at it from a kind of a human rights perspective, but looking at the bureaucracy of the EU and the challenge for the EU in creating a bureaucratic apparatus that can speak to other parts of the bureaucracy is something that is, I think, we would see it in whether it's on monetary relations, types of ways in which the EU operates in different countries. And I think why this is an important issue, particularly in the case of the border management issues and refugee processing, is because really over the last decade or so, there's been a great deal of criticism concerning the way that the EU and Frontex particularly have implemented EU-wide policies, how member states have dealt with refugee crises, and particularly EU member states such as Greece and Italy, and the concerns over the human rights issues and non-refoulement, and this is not sending people back into a conflict zone, create, I think, an impetus within the EU for what was called the New Pact on Migration and Asylum, which was passed by the EU in 2020 as an attempt to deal with, I think, several related problems, both within the EU itself, within EU agencies like Frontex, but also to coordinate and to have singular policies among member states. So this issue related to the Ukrainian crisis in Moldova is, I think, part of a much larger discussion that has been ongoing within the European Union over the last 10 years about how does the European Union establish protocols so that it respects the sovereignty of individual member states, it respects the refugee and immigration policies of individual member states, but it also creates policies in place to protect those refugees, those individuals who are migrants within a broader kind of human rights compact. And that was the intention of this new Pact on Migration and Asylum. So this research uses as a kind of a starting point to understand these kind of bureaucracies and these kind of overlapping jurisdictional issues that can arise with multiple bureaucracies. What's called a theory of jurisdictional competition that was advanced by the political scientist Nicholas and Crotty. And what he argues is that even when you have bureaucracies that have the similar core, what he calls core policy beliefs, in other words, agencies that have very similar mandates, a very similar understanding of what their role is, very similar, let's say, even jurisdictions, they still have to compete for resources, and they still have to compete over policies to pursue their own individual agency-based goals. So while these agencies may be in broad agreement with each other on, again, the needs for border management, the needs to have robust ways in which you can protect refugees, the needs for interdiction for, let's say, arms smuggling, human trafficking, and other types of criminal activities. They may share very similar belief systems, but ultimately, as bureaucracies, they have to compete with each other for resources from the Commission, from the Parliament, and therefore they can come into conflict with each other, not so much over the specific policies, but over, again, this distribution of resources. And we've already seen this occur in the case of Moldova. There's been a literature that's argued that being jurisdictional and mandates of EU bomb and EUAM have created first and foremost confusion among stakeholders in Moldova, that many times Moldovan authorities, when an issue arises, don't even know which EU agency is in charge. They don't know and understand the differentiation between organizations. They don't understand how coordination efforts have occurred at within the EU, both in country and at ministerial level as well. And so that ultimately that has undermined the ability of the EU to successfully provide technical assistance to Moldovan authorities, because the Moldovan authorities are oftentimes unclear about, frankly, who is in charge of what, and that's undermined confidence in border management. And so there's again, already, I think a literature that has indicated that there are some significant potential and real problems in the ways that the EU has structured its border management and its refugee responses, and that by adding Frontex and other EU assets to a country like Moldova, that this can only contribute to greater confusion among Moldovan authorities. So what this research was examining was, how do these three organizations work with each other in this new environment that they find themselves, where the mandate is the same, but the crisis has exacerbated the need, and whether or not they have developed either complementary or competitive policies with each other. So this is an initial stage of the research project. This initial stage, I used various source material from EU institutions, UNHCR, IOM, the government of Moldova, various data that have already been collected to examine the structure and kind of organizational challenges that Ukrainian refugee and border management has presented to these EU agencies on the front line. So this is a kind of a first attempt at trying to understand where we've been, where we are, and where we're going within the context of the bureaucratic apparatus that the EU has established within Moldova, with the understanding that this really speaks to the larger issue of EU management of refugee crises throughout the Union. In the future, I plan to supplement this work with interviews with stakeholders. I hope to be in Chisinau and to be able to have discussions with both Moldovan authorities and with the EU agencies as well, to talk about their efforts at coordination and how do they overcome some of these jurisdictional problems that have plagued the organizations in the past. What is how the refugee management and border management issues have agencies to really seriously define and increase cooperation and coordination with each other. And I think it's one of the really interesting phenomena that we as political scientists and generally as social scientists who are interested in the European Union will be examining over the next decade and even much longer, is the impact of the Ukrainian war on the European Union as an organization. We've seen pronouncements coming out of Brussels at a pace that we never would have anticipated before, We've seen coordination on issues, for instance, on energy issues that we would have never anticipated before. So just as we've seen several member states, most notably Germany, take positions that would have been unimaginable before 2022, we've also seen a steep learning curve, but also we've seen a massive change in the way the EU's had to operate as it's in this continual crisis mode. And so I think that this research speaks to this kind of greater effort that the EU has had to engage in taking issues that it has had long-term interests in, but having to significantly retool as the crisis has continued and developed. And so what has been, I think, very fascinating in the context of Moldova is that the initial EU response to border management issues in Moldova, as in many of other states, in many member states, was the refugee crisis that was ongoing. As we know, countries such as Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, there's been a huge influx of refugees within these countries. And indeed, Moldova per capita has one of the highest settlements of Ukrainian refugees within all of Europe. But again, we've seen Poland take in well over 1 million refugees. The Czech Republic actually has taken in probably the largest percentage based upon GDP of Ukrainian refugees. So I think the immediate border management issue for the European Union initially was processing refugees. And creating means by which you could set up places to live so that those individuals who wanted to remain in that particular country could transition and have educational facilities, have cash payments which have been made to them, and some cases even have language instruction to set up some form of temporary housing for these refugees as they have been using various EU member states or countries such as Moldova as a terminus point. The EU's also, of course, been coordinating transit among member states and other countries outside of the Union, such as, again, Moldova. So that was, I think, the initial crisis, the initial need that the EU identified was to deal with the significant refugee problem and the significant humanitarian problem that the EU member states, countries such as Moldova, and of course the Ukrainians themselves were facing. Concomitant with that particular border management issue was the focus on smuggling, the focus on trafficking. Those issues were dealt with early on, but those did not take front and center. It was much more about processing refugees. Now, as we've seen that refugee flow decrease, and in the case of Moldova, we were looking at about a 75% decrease in the number of individuals coming into the country on a daily basis. While we've seen that sort of real pressing humanitarian to start to dissipate, and we've seen that the numbers have gone down, the EU now has been looking at what I call kind of second wave issues, and that are the issues involved with smuggling, with human trafficking, with dealing with organized crime, arms trafficking as well. So in July of 2022, the EU created for the first time ever what it calls a support hub for internal security and border management. And it located that hub as its first test case actually in Moldova. So this support hub could have been based in any of the EU member states. It could have been based in any of the other states that also border Ukraine. But the EU chose Moldova for this because of, again, the concerns, I think, Istria, the concerns over the sheer numbers of individuals who were coming in and issues that are particular to Moldova that I'll explain here in a moment. So this is a brand new institution. The EU Support Hub is, I think, the EU's recognition of the failures of the past. And so the hub is to coordinate and support information sharing among the EU agencies. And so it is what it describes itself as. It's a support hub. It is essentially a meeting of the different these Moldovan authorities, customs officials, internal ministry officials, to kind of coordinate actions and to work together in terms of kind of border management issues. This hub was created in tandem with being delegated what was essentially executive powers for border control by the Moldovan authorities. So the EU, I think, has grown very quickly in terms of its bureaucratic sophistication, understanding for the need for greater coordination by first and foremost creating this hub so that there was essentially a working group that was much more formalized, much more inclusive than anything that they had had previously, and also working with Moldovan authorities to create kind of a lead agency on issues of border control. And the hope was that by having a lead agency work within this hub, in which it was first among peers, that it would increase the information sharing that was going to be necessary. And as an operational platform, this hub will support, again, this cooperation on internal security and border management between these different EU agencies, member states as well. So it's an information clearinghouse for the EU member states and Moldovan authorities. But what's very interesting is that the hub really is, again, dealing with the second wave issues. While certainly there's going to be discussions about refugee concerns and the processing of refugees and issues that are coming up in difficulties, many of those issues have been worked out over the last few months as you've had to really create new policies and procedures and operations to deal with the crushing crisis and humanitarian crisis that has been ongoing in Ukraine. But also it's a recognition that as the numbers have gone down, it is time to prioritize other issues. So the priority areas for the hub include firearms trafficking, in other words, arms trafficking, and the concern is that many of the arms that are being used in the Ukraine conflict will see their way into EU and then be used and ultimately sold on to organized crime, migrant smuggling, trafficking of human beings, and that trafficking is both trafficking of women, but also trafficking of children as well, preventing and countering terrorism, cybercrime, which we know that has been played a large role within the Ukrainian crisis, and ultimately drug trafficking as well. So it's interesting that this hub, that the priority areas are really reflecting much more of these issues of smuggling and interdiction on those particular different types of modalities than it is on the refugee crisis itself. The refugee crisis will still be discussed within the context of the hub. There'll be information sharing. But what I think the hub is trying to do is to say that as we've seen the refugee flow decrease, now we have to start turning our attention to these other areas so that the Ukrainian conflict does not become a pan-European conflict in the sense of seeing humans being smuggled, arms being smuggled, increasing drug trafficking, and so forth. So again, the creation of the hub is a recognition on the part of the EU, I think Moldovan authorities, that the processing of refugees has remained largely static for the last month or so, for the last couple of months really, and that they've built up a huge operational capacity. So again, if you were just to look at this particular graph, as you see, there's of course ebb and flow, but going back to April, where we saw, and this is again the number of refugees who've been arriving, we've seen a pretty marked decrease from let's say late March into April to what we see here in late July. That ability, I think, to have created this operational capacity to deal with these refugees has allowed now the EU to focus its attention onto other issues, onto these second wave issues. And these issues, and I think, again, this probably played into the thinking of the European Union, why Moldova was charged, provided as kind of the test ground for this hub, is because, for instance, issues on human trafficking in Moldova is historically been a significant problem for Moldovan authorities, has been a significant issue for organized crime in Moldova. And the hub really is, I think, a recognition that as Moldova as a country is wrestling with this particular issue, that the hub can provide even greater ability to what has always been essentially both of course, a domestic issue, but an internationalized issue as well. Moldova currently is classified by the U.S. government as a tier 2. If you were to look at the trafficking of persons report from July of 2022, and tier 2 countries are countries that don't fully meet the minimum standards for eliminating trafficking. This hub is, again, a recognition that this is a country that in and of itself has had chronically a problem with trafficking, that the problem with trafficking is going to increase exponentially, and has been increasing exponentially within the country, and that Moldova needs greater assistance. And again, if you look at the profile of the individuals who are refugees during the Ukrainian war, in the case of Moldova, 65% of those individuals crossing the border are women. 50% are children. So the concern is not just the trafficking for sex trafficking, but it's also, again, the buying and selling of children, either, again, for purpose of sexual exploitation, but for other means as well. So this, I think, because the profile of the refugees, it makes, again, trafficking an acute problem for Moldovan authorities. And it's, again, a problem that Moldova has struggled with historically. So the hub really is a recognition that the EU needs to increase not only coordination amongst its agencies and fine-tune its policies interagency, but also, if it's going to be dealing with these substantial priority areas, Moldova is the perfect case country to do so. I think what this research has shown, and again, it's been an evolving research that has only been undergone the last few months as we've had this Ukrainian crisis, is that the EU has experienced on issues of refugee and migration policy for, the last 10 years. And the 2020 Pact was a recognition of the EU that had to implement both within Frontex and within member states new and enhanced policies to deal with the human rights issues for refugees. But just as the war in Ukraine, I think, has refocused the EU in many different policy areas, it does seem that the EU is taking much more proactive steps than we have seen in the past, specifically not only to assist refugees in the case of Moldova, but to understand and to deal with these second wave problems as the conflict goes and extends out from Ukraine into places like Moldova and into the broader EU as well. So the Ukrainian crisis has really served, once again, to underscore that the EU as an institution has grown, and in a very crisis situation has implemented policies with a speed that we've not seen before, and understands the need for greater coordination. Over the next, this is a snapshot of where we're at right now. The hub is only had one meeting as I have this presentation in August of 2022. It'll be very interesting to take a look over the next year, 2 years, 5 years down the road to see how successful these policies have been. But it is, I think, a testament to the EU that organizations like the hub have been created, that they have been working with local authorities to create lead institutions, and that ultimately the EU has understood that it needs to create in space where there's greater ability for cooperation, not just competition among different EU agencies. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to be with you today. And again, I want to thank the center for all their support.